engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious leaders, innovators, and people who are ready for the next level and beyond.
Welcome to another edition of Pure Reinvention. As we've had a chance to do a number of these, we found that it's much more interesting to have a co-host. So I've asked Misty Elliott to co-host with me again today. How are you, Misty?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to be here, Mike.
Well, Misty, one of the things that we've talked about many times with Pure Reinvention is what we want to call step number 2, which is the ownership part of reinvention. And Misty, as we look at reinvention, what does that ownership mean to you in the Pure Reinvention process?
Well, I can't really answer that question without doing a quick recap of your podcast about disruption that I recently listened to. And as I was listening to it, I identified with the fact that I'm a disruptor and I like to create disruption. However, when you disrupt something, I was thinking about it, and you really need to come around and own it, because when you disrupt something without ownership, it's super counterproductive. The real reason you want to disrupt something is to move it off center so you can prepare for the next phase of what that disruption is going to cause.
I think that's a wonderful thought, and that each of these steps in the Pure Reinvention process is a series of waves. Each of the waves is meant to build upon each other. And Misty, you're exactly right. If you just disrupt for the sense of disruption, which there are people in the world who believe that's their primary mission, that really is a very counterproductive activity, because the process of disruption actually opens up the space to allow you to take ownership of whatever is going to happen next. And for a lot of people, that ownership is a very elusive part of this process, because in ownership is where we build the accountability. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with executives and boards where they've really struggled trying to nail down the accountability piece in ownership. Yet we realize that anything really important in our lives and in our careers, in anything important that we're building, we have to know who the owners are that we can count on in this process. So Misty, as you kind of think about disruption and in the second step, how do you see ownership fitting in when you really think about the accountability piece?
You told me once that owning disruption allows you to fully understand the problem. And that resonates with me, because when you own it, that means that you are prepared to get to the root of that problem and really look at it from an analytical angle. And taking on that ownership helps you reinvent yourself, helps you really question what the root of was going on in your organization.
It's been very surprising to me as I've worked with a number of groups who've really struggled with this ownership piece, because it seems like that anything significant and of this much importance requires an absolute degree of ownership that is necessary for success. Yet I sometimes wonder in board structures and even in the executive suites whether we really have the true ownership and accountability piece to really deliver through what Pure Reinvention is suggesting. Pure Reinvention is a great opportunity for those that are willing to take ownership and willing to be accountable to that ownership. But make no mistake about it, ownership is a huge piece. And Misty, I think you and I would both agree that there are certain characteristics to ownership that we look for. Can you give us an example of a characteristics of ownership that you have begun to notice in the Pure Reinvention process?
My personal ownership? Is that what you're asking about? For sure. I've taken on a lot of ownership with Pure Reinvention. I found myself transitioning from saying, you need to do this, or what would be good for Pure Reinvention, to we need to move Pure Reinvention forward. We need to get on Twitter. We need to write, build out our website, write some stuff and really define it. And as I did that, it was how I framed in my head, how am I going to take this to the next step? And then I felt that ownership. I knew that I was owning the idea behind Pure Reinvention because I wanted to see it succeed and move forward.
So Misty's beginning to describe what is really to follow ownership. She first talked about how disruption sets up the opportunity to own. She's now describing that as you own whatever the direction it is that you're going, as you take ownership, that sets up the next phase. And you begin to see that when one accepts the responsibility for the step prior, it sets up and allows for the next step to start developing. And so many times a strategic planning or a reinvention process will fail because when we can't take ownership of what is about to happen next, or we can't take ownership of what is our responsibility to develop, then there's no opportunity to go forward, because without ownership means there's no reality to it. And so, Misty, as you began to describe that in your own professional journey with the Pure Reinvention Project, you began to say that as I moved from describing what somebody else should do to describing my role within the reinvention process, I began to own my piece of that real estate. And when I begin to own my piece of that real estate, the opportunity to go to the next step becomes a part of the process, and so therefore allows us to move forward on that continuum.
And admittedly, we're supposed to be honest through this process, right? So I'm going to be honest with you right now. Taking that ownership is a little scary, because then if it's screwed up, it's not somebody else's problem, it's yours.
So how does one work through that process of being hesitant about ownership, because then I also have to be accountable for whatever happens as a result?
I'm still learning that, but I think what it is admitting that there's going to be failures and that that's going to be okay. That it's all right to screw up, and even if you're owning something, you can take a risk, and if you're willing to learn from that failure or that risk that you take, you'll have room to grow, and I think that's key.
Probably one of the most difficult circumstances that as an executive one has to learn is the ability to be a good risk manager. Misty, you're describing that in this process of moving from employee to owner, or from idea generator to owner acceptance, one has to be able to assess the risk involved with the movement that's about to take place, and one has to take responsibility for that movement, even though some of whatever is going to happen in the future is somewhat unpredictable. And we have to have some confidence, and we have to have some sense that the direction that we're going in total is the right direction, even though sometimes specifically we don't know exactly each step and how it's going to be carried out today. Now that becomes much clearer going down through the process, but today, as we take ownership of the direction rather than ownership of a specific function, we're able to then accept what we know, and we're also willing to accept what we don't know. And once we can start to get to the point where we can accept what we don't know and are willing to start developing the ability to do the risk assessment around those things, to look at the different opportunities that are available to us and begin to synthesize and coordinate those opportunities into a generalized direction that we want to go, we now begin to process potential opportunities and looking at different deliverables as opposed to a win-lose. And once we get to that point, our ability to view the landscape dramatically changes.
Mm-hmm. And it's that apprehension, that kind of discomfort where you're taking that step into ownership and taking that risk that it comes back on you, that creates the fertile ground for change, for reinvention, for questioning things from a new perspective, because you are uncomfortable and you are looking at how to fix that and find an equilibrium again.
I believe that most people who are going through the reinvention process will describe a degree of discomfort that they hadn't really realized before. The predictability of knowing what's going to happen is somewhat the enemy of the ability to really move forward. And so we do move away and out of our comfort zone. We have to take ownership of that which we don't even realize or understand completely today is exactly the outcome. We do the risk assessment to know, even though we're moving in a new direction, we're moving in a direction that's in the best interest of the association or ourselves professionally, and then start to own the entire process. So when we look at step 2 as a significant part of whether reinvention is going to be successful or not, we're able to then move either forward at different degrees.
So do you have an ownership story that you'd like to share with us? I would really like to hear from our listeners. Connect with us on Twitter or Facebook at PureReinvention and let us know what your story is about ownership and taking ownership of a new opportunity within your organization.
If you're ready to change, make a change that lasts. Make it Pure Reinvention. Thank you, Misty.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new episodes are available by following us on Twitter at Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.